There is a place that has always existed, long before there were eyes to see it or minds to understand it. It stretches across most of this planet's surface, covering more than 2/3 of everything beneath the sky. It is deep beyond easy comprehension, dark in its lowest reaches, cold in ways that are difficult to imagine. It moves constantly, and yet, in its deepest layers, it is almost perfectly still. This place is the ocean, and within it, over enormous stretches of time, some of the largest living things this world has ever produced came slowly, quietly, and gradually into being. The story of the ocean's giants is not a story of sudden appearances or dramatic moments. It is a story of slow time, of millions of years passing one after another, each one nearly identical to the last, and each one contributing in the smallest possible way to the gradual unfolding of something vast. It is the kind of story that is best told softly and listened to gently, because its pace is not the pace of human life. Its pace is geological. It is measured in epochs, in eras, in the slow drift of continents across the surface of the world. To understand how the largest creatures in the history of life came to inhabit the sea, it is necessary to begin very far back, not with the whales or the sharks or the great marine reptiles of ancient time, but with the ocean itself, with water, with chemistry, with the first faint stirrings of life in conditions that would seem entirely alien to any living thing today. The Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. For much of its earliest history, it was a place of intense heat, of volcanic activity, of a surface still cooling and reshaping itself in ways that were violent and continuous. The early atmosphere was different from the one that surrounds us now. It held little of the oxygen that living things today depend upon. It was thick with other gases, with water vapor, with carbon dioxide, with nitrogen and sulfur compounds rising from the interior of a young and restless planet. And yet, water arrived. It arrived over time, through a combination of processes that scientists continue to study with great care. Some of it came from within the planet itself, released through volcanic activity as gases that eventually condensed and fell as rain across a cooling surface. Some of it may have arrived from beyond the Earth, carried by comets and asteroids that struck a young planet repeatedly during a period of heavy bombardment. However it came, water gathered, it pooled, it filled the low places of a young and uneven surface, and slowly, over millions of years, the first oceans formed. These early oceans were not the oceans that exist today. They were chemically different. They were likely somewhat acidic. They were warm in ways that modern oceans are not, warmed from below by a planet that still retained enormous heat from its formation. They had no salt concentrations quite like the ones familiar now, though salt and minerals dissolved into them gradually over time as water moved across rock, dissolving and carrying minerals to the sea. They were, in many ways, a harsh and strange environment, but they were also somehow the place where life began. The precise moment at which life first appeared on Earth is not known. It is something that scientists continue to investigate and debate thoughtfully and carefully. What is understood is that life was present in the oceans at least 3.5 billion years ago, and perhaps earlier. The evidence for this comes from ancient rocks, from formations called stromatolites, which are layered structures created by communities of microorganisms called cyanobacteria. These organisms were small beyond imagining. They were single cells, without nuclei, without the complex internal structures that define the cells of more familiar living things. They were simple in their construction, but they were alive, and they were doing something that would slowly change the entire planet over billions of years. Cyanobacteria were capable of photosynthesis, that they could capture the energy of sunlight and use it to build their bodies from simple chemical ingredients, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. This process, which seems so ordinary when contemplated today, was at that time one of the most transformative things that had ever happened on the surface of the earth. For billions of years, oxygen had been largely absent from the atmosphere in significant quantities. As cyanobacteria spread through the shallow oceans, generation after generation, their released oxygen began to accumulate. Slowly, over hundreds of millions of years, the composition of the atmosphere changed. This change was not rapid. Nothing in this story is rapid. It happened across time so vast that it is difficult to hold in the mind. Imagine a single cyanobacterium releasing a single molecule of oxygen. Now imagine that happening uncountable trillions of times every moment for hundreds of millions of years. The effect was cumulative. The oxygen built up. And as it did, it transformed the chemistry of both the atmosphere and the ocean, making possible forms of life that could not have existed before. This period of biological and chemical transition is sometimes called the Great Oxidation Event, and it occurred roughly 2.25 billion years ago, though the process itself extended across hundreds of millions of years before and after that approximate date. Its relevance to the story of the ocean's giants is foundational, because without oxygen-rich environments, the complex metabolisms required by large, active animals could not function. The stage was being set, slowly and patiently, for the eventual emergence of animals, and eventually for the emergence of very large animals. But the oceans of 2 billion years ago were still a world of the microscopic. The dominant life forms were still single-celled organisms. The ocean was not empty of life, but it was a different kind of fullness than what would come later. There were no fish, no shell-bearing creatures, no things that swam with fins or propelled themselves through the water with muscular bodies. There were microbes, and there were the chemical transformations those microbes set in motion, and there was time. Enormous, quiet, unhurried time. A significant transition occurred, though its exact timing is still studied carefully by scientists. At some point, cells with nuclei appeared. These are called eukaryotic cells, distinguished from the earlier, simpler prokaryotic cells by the presence of a nucleus containing genetic material, as well as other internal structures called organelles. The origin of eukaryotic cells appears to have involved a profound partnership between previously separate organisms, a process in which one type of cell came to live permanently inside another, the two becoming so interdependent that they eventually functioned as a single organism. This arrangement is called endosymbiosis, and its consequences for the history of life were enormous. With eukaryotic cells came the possibility of more complex forms of life. And eventually, eukaryotic cells began to form communities, groups of cells that remained together and over long periods of time began to specialize, some cells performing different functions than others. This was the beginning of multicellular life, organisms composed of many cells working together. The earliest multicellular organisms appeared perhaps around 1 billion years ago, though evidence from that time is fragmentary, and the picture continues to be refined as new discoveries are made. The Ediacaran period, which lasted from roughly 635 million years ago to around 541 million years ago, provide some of the earliest evidence of complex multicellular life. The organisms of this period were soft-bodied, leaving behind impressions in ancient sediment rather than the hard shells and bones that preserve more easily. They were strange and varied in form, some resembling nothing that exists today. Some were flat and frond-like, anchored to the seafloor. Others moved, or may have moved, though slowly and in ways not entirely clear. They were not large by the standards of what would eventually come, but they represented something entirely new, bodies of significant complexity visible to the naked eye, living in the ancient ocean. It is worth pausing for a moment to appreciate the vastness of the time that had already passed before these Ediacaran creatures appeared. From the formation of the Earth to the Ediacaran period is approximately 4 billion years. 4 billion years of a planet cooling, of oceans forming, of microbes transforming the chemistry of an entire world, before anything remotely resembling the animals familiar today came to exist. The ocean had been there for billions of years before anything swam in it in the way we might recognize as swimming. The ocean had existed before there were eyes to see it, before there was anything to sense its depth or its cold or its darkness. It was simply there, ancient and patient, holding its chemistry and its microbial inhabitants across spans of time that resist easy comprehension. The next great threshold came at the beginning of what geologists call the Paleozoic era, specifically in its first period, the Cambrian, which began approximately 541 million years ago. The Cambrian period is notable for what is sometimes described as an explosion of animal diversity, though the word explosion is somewhat misleading if taken to imply suddenness. It was not sudden by any measure that a human being would recognize. It unfolded over tens of millions of years, but by geological standards. The diversification of animal body plans that took place during this period was rapid and significant. During the Cambrian, the ocean filled with a variety of animals unlike anything that had existed before. Many of them had hard parts, shells and exoskeletons and other mineralized structures that preserved well in rock, which is one reason the fossil record of this period is richer than what came before. There were animals with jointed legs, early arthropods that would eventually give rise to a long lineage of creatures, including today's crabs and insects. There were mollusks, the ancestors of modern clams and snails and octopuses. There were worm-like animals of many kinds. There were filter feeders anchored to the seafloor and active swimmers moving through the water column and bottom dwellers moving slowly across the sediment. And there were, in these ancient Cambrian seas, the earliest ancestors of what would eventually become vertebrate animals, and through the vertebrates, eventually the great whales and other large sea creatures that are central to this story. These earliest proto-vertebrates were small and simple, soft-bodied creatures that possessed the beginnings of a notochord, a stiffening rod that runs along the body and provides structural support. One of the most famous of these early creatures is called Pikaia, known from the extraordinary Burgess shale deposits of what is now Western Canada. Pikaia was a small, swimming creature, a few centimeters in length with a flattened body and what appears to be a primitive notochord. It was not yet a true vertebrate, but it belonged to the group from which all vertebrates would eventually descend. The ocean of the Cambrian was warm by modern standards, the continents arranged differently from today, most of them gathered in the southern hemisphere in a configuration quite unlike the one that is familiar now. The sea covered large portions of what are now land surfaces. It was a shallower, warmer, more uniformly distributed ocean than the one that wraps around the Earth at present, and it teemed with life in its shallow coastal regions, a riot of evolutionary experimentation, bodies of every conceivable shape and structure, most of which would leave no living descendants. The period following the Cambrian, the Ordovician, brought further diversification. Marine ecosystems grew more complex. Coral reefs, or their early analogues, began to appear, providing structured habitats that supported a greater diversity of organisms. A jawless fish, the early vertebrates, became more varied and more common. These were small creatures, armored in some cases with bony plates, filtering food from sediment or water, moving through an ocean that was still very far from being populated by anything that could be called a giant. It is useful to think about what size requires. Large body size in an animal is not simply a matter of growing bigger. It requires an efficient means of obtaining food in sufficient quantities. It requires a metabolic system capable of sustaining a large body. It requires structural support, whether through an internal skeleton or some other means, and it requires a sufficiently food-rich environment to make large body size viable. In the early Paleozoic, the ocean was rich in life, but the food chains had not yet developed the complexity and productivity that would eventually support truly enormous animals. During the Silurian period, which followed the Ordovician and lasted from roughly 444 million years ago to 419 million years ago, something significant happened in the vertebrate lineage. Jaws appeared. The development of jaws from what had previously been gill arches, structural elements associated with breathing, was a gradual transformation that took place over many generations. But its consequences for the ecology of the ocean were profound. Jawed fish could bite. They could pursue and capture prey in ways that jawless fish could not. They could eat a much wider variety of food items. Jaws opened up ecological possibilities that had not previously existed. The early jawed fishes were not large by later standards, but they were formidable within the ecosystems of their time, and their appearance set the stage for the development of larger, more powerful predators in the periods that followed. The Devonian period, lasting from approximately 419 million years ago to 359 million years ago, is sometimes called the Age of Fishes, and with good reason. During this period, fish diversified enormously. The oceans, and to a growing extent the freshwater environments of rivers and lakes, became populated with an extraordinary variety of fish forms. There were the placoderms, armored fish with bony plates covering their heads and front portions of their bodies, some of which grew to considerable size. The most famous of the placoderms is Dunkleosteus, not an apex predator of its time, which could reach lengths of perhaps 6 to 9 meters or even more according to some estimates, with powerful jaws capable of exerting enormous force. It was not a giant by the standards of what would eventually evolve in the ocean, but it was, in its time, among the largest and most powerful predators that had ever existed. There were also, during the Devonian, the ancestors of sharks. The earliest shark-like fishes had appeared even before the Devonian, but during this period they became more diverse and more established as a distinct lineage. These early sharks were not identical to modern sharks in all respects, but they shared the fundamental design that has made sharks so enduringly successful. A cartilaginous skeleton rather than a bony one, a streamlined body, and sensory systems well adapted to detecting prey in the water. And it was in the Devonian that a remarkable thing began to happen at the margins of the ocean. Some fish developed the ability to breathe air and to support themselves on their fins well enough to move, however clumsily, on land. This was a gradual process, not a sudden crossing from water to shore, but a slow exploration of shallow water and tidal zones by creatures whose descendants would eventually become fully terrestrial. This development is enormously important to the long story of the ocean's giants, because some of the largest creatures that would eventually return to the sea were descended from these pioneering fish, from animals that left the water, spent hundreds of millions of years on land, and then, in entirely separate evolutionary episodes, returned. The Devonian ended with a mass extinction, one of several significant extinction events in the history of life. The causes of these events are complex and still studied, but their effects on the diversity of marine life were substantial. Many lineages were lost. Others survived, and from the survivors, new ecosystems would eventually be rebuilt. The Carboniferous period followed, stretching from approximately 359 million years ago to 299 million years ago. During this time, the ocean continued to support diverse fish communities, including increasingly varied shark lineages. Some of these early sharks had forms quite different from modern sharks, with unusual fin arrangements and tooth structures that reflect the ongoing experimentation of evolution across this long period of time. On land, the descendants of the Devonian fish continued to diversify, developing more efficient limbs, more effective breathing systems, and eventually the ability to reproduce without returning to water. These were the amniotes, and from this group would come reptiles, birds, and mammals, including, in time, the mammals that would return to the sea. The Permian period, which ended approximately 252 million years ago, concluded with what scientists describe as the most severe extinction event in the history of multicellular life. The exact causes of the end Permian extinction are still debated among researchers, but it is associated with massive volcanic activity in what is now Siberia, with the release of enormous quantities of gases that altered the chemistry of the atmosphere and the ocean, with warming, with acidification of the sea, and with the loss of oxygen in marine environments. The scale of biological loss was staggering. Perhaps 90% or more of all marine species disappeared. The ocean's ecosystems were, in a very real sense, devastated. But life did not end. It never quite ends, even in the face of catastrophic disruption. Some lineages survived, and from those survivors, the slow work of rebuilding began. And it is in the aftermath of this great extinction, in the Mesozoic era that followed, that the story of ocean giants truly begins to take shape. The Triassic period, the first of the three great Mesozoic periods, began approximately 252 million years ago. The ocean was recovering, slowly and unevenly, from the end Permian catastrophe. New ecosystems were assembling themselves from whatever had survived, and among the creatures that began to diversify and spread into the recovering marine environment were reptiles. Reptiles had evolved on land from the amniot lineage that had first appeared in the Carboniferous. They were air-breathing animals, with lungs rather than gills, with limbs rather than fins, with body plans adapted to life on dry land. And yet, during the Triassic, several lineages of reptiles returned to the sea. This return to the ocean was not a simple reversal. It was a complex, gradual transformation of body plans over millions of generations. The limbs of these early marine reptiles became modified, gradually losing their ability to support the animal on land and becoming increasingly adapted for movement through water. The body became more streamlined. Various adaptations for an aquatic lifestyle developed, including in some cases the ability to give birth to live young rather than laying eggs on land, which would have been necessary for a fully marine existence. Among the earliest of these returning marine reptiles were creatures called ichthyosaurs, whose name means fish lizards, though they were not lizards or fish in any strict sense. The early ichthyosaurs of the Triassic were already recognizable in their basic form, with elongated bodies and 4 limbs modified into paddle-like structures. Over the course of the Triassic and into the subsequent Jurassic period, ichthyosaurs evolved toward a more streamlined fish-like form, with a tail fin, a dorsal fin, and front flippers larger and more powerful than the rear ones. But they became highly efficient swimmers, and some lineages grew to impressive size. The largest of the ichthyosaurs, known from remains found in various parts of the world, may have reached lengths of 15 to 20 meters or perhaps more, making them among the largest animals to have existed up to that point in the history of life. They were not simple predators. They occupied a variety of ecological roles, with some species apparently specialized for feeding on soft-bodied prey like squid, and others with teeth and body forms, suggesting a diet of fish or other marine vertebrates. They were warm in ways that may have resembled modern tuna, rather than typical reptiles, capable of generating body heat through their metabolism and maintaining higher body temperatures than the surrounding water, which would have allowed them to be more active, more efficient predators. Alongside the ichthyosaurs in the Triassic seas were other marine reptiles, including early forms of creatures called plesiosaurs. The plesiosaurs were quite different in their body plan from the ichthyosaurs, with broad, flattened bodies, long necks in many species, and 4 large flippers used for propulsion through the water. They were descended from a different group of reptiles than the ichthyosaurs, and their return to the sea was an entirely independent event, another example of what biologists call convergent evolution, the tendency of different evolutionary lineages to arrive at similar adaptations when faced with similar environmental challenges. The Triassic Ocean was not yet the place of maximum marine reptile diversity. That would come in the periods that followed. But the Triassic established the fundamental patterns, the entry of large reptile lineages into the sea, the development of increasingly marine body forms, the occupation of ecological roles as large predators and large-bodied swimmers in an ocean that had previously been without creatures of that size in those ecological positions. During this entire span of time, from the early Cambrian to the end of the Triassic, covering nearly 400 million years of geological history, the ocean was changing in other ways as well. The continents were moving. The configuration of land and sea was shifting, slowly but continuously, as the plates of the Earth's crust moved across the underlying mantle. In the early Paleozoic, much of the land was concentrated in the southern hemisphere, with a large ancient ocean called the Panthalassa covering much of the planet. By the Triassic, most of the land had come together into a single supercontinent called Pangaea, surrounded by that ancient global ocean and bordered by a large embayment to the east called the Tethys Sea. The Tethys was warm and shallow in many areas, and it would prove to be an important region for the evolution of many marine lineages, including, much later, the early ancestors of the whales. Pangaea was beginning to break apart by the end of the Triassic. The great cracks forming in the supercontinent would widen over the subsequent periods of the Mesozoic, creating new ocean basins as previously connected land masses separated and the water filled in between them. The Atlantic Ocean, for example, did not exist in the early Triassic. It came into being gradually as North America and Europe separated, and Africa and South America separated over tens of millions of years. The creation of new ocean basins changed the patterns of ocean circulation, altered temperatures, affected the distribution of nutrients, and created new environments in which new forms of life could evolve. The Triassic itself ended with another extinction event, smaller in scale than the end Permian catastrophe, but still significant, again associated with massive volcanic activity, this time from a region called the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. This extinction cleared space for what came in the Jurassic, a period of renewed diversification in the sea, of the flourishing of marine reptile lineages, of the continued evolution of sharks and fish, and of the beginnings of changes that would eventually lead to the ocean giants most familiar today. The ocean at the beginning of the Jurassic period was a different place from the ocean of the Cambrian or the Devonian. It was populated by more complex ecosystems, with more layers of predation, with more diverse forms of life at every level, from the microscopic to the very large. The phytoplankton that drifted in the sunlit surface waters, converting sunlight to food, had diversified into many different groups. The zooplankton that fed on them had similarly diversified, and above them, the food chains extended through fish and marine reptiles to the largest predators in the sea. It is in this ocean, during the Jurassic and the period that followed it, the Cretaceous, that the ocean's Mesozoic giants reached their greatest sizes and their greatest ecological dominance. And understanding those Mesozoic giants is essential to understanding how the story eventually arrived at its most recent chapter, the return of mammals to the sea and the evolution of the largest animals ever to have lived on Earth, the great whales. The Jurassic period lasted from approximately 201 million years ago to 145 million years ago. During this time, the ichthyosaurs were at or near the peak of their diversity and abundance. Plesiosaurs were flourishing and diversifying, and new groups of marine reptiles were also establishing themselves in the sea. Among the plesiosaurs, two very different body forms had evolved. Some plesiosaurs had long necks and relatively small heads, with 4 broad flippers and a compact body. They are often described as resembling a large turtle with a long snake threaded through its body, though this image is not quite accurate in its details. These long-necked plesiosaurs fed on fish and soft-bodied prey, using their long necks to pursue prey in ways that their broad-bodied forms would have allowed. Other plesiosaurs had short, thick necks and enormously large heads filled with powerful teeth. These are called pliosaurs, and they were among the apex predators of the Jurassic Sea. Some pliosaurs, like the creature known as Pliosaurus, reached lengths of perhaps 10 to 12 meters or more, with skulls of remarkable size and jaws capable of exerting tremendous bite force. They were, in their ecological role, something like the great white sharks of their time, only considerably larger and more powerful. The prey of these great marine reptiles included fish, other marine reptiles, ammonites, coiled cephalopods related to the modern nautilus, and belemnites, another group of extinct cephalopods, squid-like in general form. The Jurassic seas were rich in these animals, and this richness provided the food base necessary to support large, active predators. The diversity and abundance of life in the Jurassic Ocean was connected to the chemistry and temperature of the sea. The Jurassic world was generally warmer than the present day, with no polar ice caps and a more equable distribution of temperature from equator to pole. This warmth supported high rates of biological productivity in the ocean. The seas were rich in dissolved minerals carried from the land, and in sunlight filtered through an atmosphere somewhat different from the one that exists today. Phytoplankton thrived. Zooplankton thrived on the phytoplankton. Fish thrived on the zooplankton, and the whole food web supported large animals at its upper levels. This was a world in which size was possible, in which the energy available from food was sufficient to support bodies of great dimension, and in which the ocean had sufficient depth and expanse to accommodate the movement and needs of very large animals. It was a world, in short, that had been preparing itself for hundreds of millions of years to host the largest living things in its history. And while the Mesozoic giants were impressive by almost any measure, they were not yet the largest. That distinction would belong to the animals that came later. None after another great extinction had cleared the sea of its reptilian rulers and opened the way for something entirely new. The Cretaceous period, the last of the Mesozoic eras, lasted from approximately 145 million years ago to 66 million years ago. It was a time of continued warmth, of high sea levels as the continents continued their slow movement, and new ocean crust was created at spreading ridges, pushing water up onto the continental shelves and creating vast shallow inland seas in regions that are today dry land. The Western Interior Seaway, for example, divided North America into two separate landmasses for much of the Cretaceous. A shallow, warm sea stretching from what is now the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean. In these Cretaceous seas, a new group of marine reptiles appeared and flourished. These were the mosasaurs, large predatory lizards that had returned to the sea from terrestrial ancestors. Unlike the ichthyosaurs, which had been returning to the sea since the early Triassic, the mosasaurs were a more recent addition to the marine fauna, appearing perhaps 80 or 90 million years ago and diversifying rapidly. They were elongated animals with powerful tails and reduced but still functional limbs, their bodies adapted for movement through the water while retaining some of the features of their terrestrial lizard ancestors. Some mosasaurs grew to very large size. Mosasaurus itself, the creature that gave the group its name, may have reached lengths of 13 to 14 meters. Hanosaurus, another large member of the group, was of similar or greater size. These were formidable predators in the Cretaceous seas, feeding on fish, ammonites, other marine reptiles, and seabirds. They had diversified into many ecological niches, with different species showing adaptations for different prey types and different hunting strategies, some with crushing teeth for eating hard-shelled prey, others with sharper teeth for catching fish. The Cretaceous was also the time during which the ichthyosaurs declined and eventually disappeared, for reasons that are not entirely clear. They had been among the most successful marine reptiles for over 150 million years, but by the late Cretaceous, they were gone. The plesiosaurs persisted to the very end of the Cretaceous, with some remarkably large species living in the final millions of years of the Mesozoic, but they too disappeared at the boundary that marks the end of that era. That boundary, done 66 million years ago, marks one of the most significant transitions in the history of life. A large asteroid struck the Earth in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, releasing an amount of energy that is difficult to comprehend. The impact threw enormous quantities of material into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, causing temperatures to fall, disrupting ecosystems across the planet. Volcanic activity in what is now India also contributed to environmental stress during this period. The result was the end Cretaceous mass extinction, which eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs on land and cleared the Mesozoic marine reptiles from the sea. The mosasaurs were gone. The plesiosaurs were gone. The large predatory marine reptiles that had dominated the ocean for over 150 million years disappeared, and the sea was left without its giants. But this apparent ending was, in the long view of geological time, the beginning of something new. The mammals that had lived in the shadow of the dinosaurs for over 160 million years suddenly found themselves in a world from which their largest competitors and predators had been removed. And on land, they diversified with remarkable speed. And in the sea, still populated by fish and sharks and the smaller survivors of the extinction, a new opportunity existed for large animals to fill the ecological roles that the marine reptiles had abandoned. The stage was set for the next great chapter in the story of the ocean's giants. The mammals were coming. They would come slowly, as all things in this story come over millions of years, transforming themselves from land-dwelling animals into creatures of the deep ocean, growing over time to sizes that exceeded anything that had come before. But that is a story for the next part of this long, quiet account, a story that belongs to the warm, recovering ocean of the Paleogene, to the ancient ancestor of all the great whales, to an animal that once walked on 4 legs in a shallow sea that no longer exists. For now, it is enough to rest in the knowledge of what came before, of the enormous spans of time that built the foundation, of the microbes and the Cambrian animals and the Devonian fish and the great marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, of an ocean that existed for billions of years before anything swam in it, and that went through transformation after transformation, extinction after extinction, always recovering, always rebuilding, always providing the deep cold in the ancient water in which new forms of life could slowly, patiently find their way to greatness. The ocean is still there. It has always been there, and it holds within it the memory of all that has ever lived in it, in the sediment and the chemistry and the deep silence of its lowest places. It is a very old place, and it has seen everything that this story contains, and it remains patient and deep and vast as it has always been. The world that emerged from the end Cretaceous extinction was a quieter ocean in some respects. The great marine reptiles were gone. The ammonites, which had filled the ancient seas for hundreds of millions of years with their beautifully coiled shells, were also gone. The belemnites had vanished. Much of what had characterized the Mesozoic ocean was absent, and the ecosystems that remained were simpler, less layered, less dominated by the very large. But the ocean recovered. It always recovers, given sufficient time. And the Paleogene period, which began at that 66 million year boundary and lasted until approximately 23 million years ago, was the time in which recovery happened, in which new forms of life diversified into the spaces left by the extinction, and in which the mammals that had survived the catastrophe began their long, slow, extraordinary diversification into nearly every ecological role available to them. On land, the mammals expanded. Where before they had been small, mostly nocturnal creatures, living carefully in a world ruled by large reptiles, they now had the freedom to grow larger, to be active by day, to develop a remarkable variety of forms. The ancestors of modern horses, rhinoceroses, elephants, rodents, primates, carnivores, and all other mammalian groups were establishing themselves during the Paleogene, evolving their characteristic forms, filling the ecological space that had been cleared by the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. And at the edges of the sea, in the warm, shallow waters of the ancient Tethys region, a group of hoofed mammals began a gradual, tentative, and ultimately transformative engagement with the aquatic environment. These were the ancestors of whales. The idea that whales evolved from terrestrial hoofed mammals was for a long time one of those scientific facts that seemed almost too strange to accept. Whales are so thoroughly adapted to the ocean, so completely transformed in their body form, that the connection to land-dwelling ancestors can seem improbable. But the fossil record, particularly discoveries made over the past few decades in Pakistan and India and Egypt, has revealed this connection with remarkable clarity. And molecular biology, the study of genetic relationships between living animals, has confirmed what the fossils suggested, that whales are most closely related to the even-toed ungulates, the group that includes deer, pigs, hippopotamuses, and cattle. Among living animals, the hippo is the whale's closest relative, a fact that continues to attract comment and quiet reflection from those who learn it. The transition from land to sea that produced the whales began approximately 53 to 55 million years ago in the early Eocene epoch. The earliest known ancestor of whales that shows clear signs of aquatic adaptation is a creature called Pachycetus, known from fossils found in what is now Pakistan. Pachycetus was not a whale in any sense that would be immediately recognizable. It was a four-legged animal, roughly dog-sized or perhaps somewhat larger, with a skull that showed the particular arrangement of ear bones that is distinctive to the whale lineage. It lived in and around rivers and shallow water, and it was probably a capable swimmer. But it spent time on land as well. Its legs were functional. Its body was that of a terrestrial mammal that spent a great deal of time in the water, much as a hippopotamus does today. The fossils of Pachycetus and its close relatives are found in sediments that were deposited in river systems and near the shores of the ancient Tethys Sea, in a region that was then warm and humid, with rivers carrying nutrients from the land into the shallow coastal waters. This was an environment rich in fish, and it seems likely that the ancestors of whales were exploiting this resource, wading and swimming in pursuit of prey, gradually becoming more dependent on the aquatic environment as time passed, and as their descendants became better and better adapted to it. What happened over the next several million years was a gradual transformation of the body, driven by the ordinary mechanisms of evolution, by variation within populations, and the differential survival and reproduction of individuals with slightly better adaptations for an aquatic life. It was not directed or purposeful. It was the slow accumulation of small changes over generations too numerous to count, each change slightly improving the ability of the animal to find food and survive in its environment. From the early Pachycetus-like ancestors, the whale lineage moved through a series of intermediate forms that are now known from an increasingly detailed fossil record. Ambulocetus, known from rocks approximately 50 million years old, was a larger animal than Pachycetus, perhaps the size of a sea lion, with limbs that were clearly functional both for walking on land and for swimming in the water. Its body proportions suggest it may have hunted somewhat like a crocodile, lurking in shallow water and ambushing prey that came to drink or that passed close by. Its hind legs were large and powerful, and it may have used them as the primary propulsive force when swimming, while its front limbs provided steering. Rhodocetus, from approximately 47 million years ago, represents a further stage of transition. Its forelimbs were becoming more paddle-like, reduced in their ability to support the animal's weight on land, but more effective in the water. Its hind limbs were smaller relative to the body than those of Ambulocetus. Its vertebral column showed flexibility in the lower back and hip region that is associated with the undulating swimming motion of the tail that characterizes whales and dolphins today. It was still amphibious, and still capable of some movement on land, but it was spending more of its life in the water, and its descendants would spend more still. Basilosaurus, from approximately 40 to 34 million years ago, represents a stage at which the whale body plan was almost fully marine. Basilosaurus is one of the most famous of the early whales, and its fossils have been found in North Africa, North America, and elsewhere, indicating that by this time whale ancestors were widespread in the ocean. It was an elongated animal, with a body that could reach 15 to 18 meters in length in some specimens, though much of this length was in a slender, sinuous posterior portion of the body rather than in a massive, deep-chested form. It retained tiny hind limbs, vestigial structures that would have been useless for locomotion, but that persisted as evolutionary remnants of the limbs of its terrestrial ancestors. Its skull was elongated, its teeth were formidable, and it was clearly a predator in the open ocean rather than an inhabitant of shallow coastal waters. The name Basilosaurus means king lizard, a reflection of the fact that when its fossils were first discovered in the 19th century, they were mistaken for those of a reptile. This misidentification has since been thoroughly corrected, and Basilosaurus is now well understood as an early whale, representing a stage of evolution perhaps 30 million years after the first amphibious ancestors had begun their return to the sea. Contemporary with Basilosaurus and sharing some of the same environments were smaller, though more dolphin-like early whales called Dorudontines. These were more compact in body form than Basilosaurus, more maneuverable, and they appear to have been able to feed on different prey. They were still early whales in the technical sense, still bearing the distinctive ear anatomy of the whale lineage, but their body form was already approaching something that would be recognizable as an ancestor of the modern toothed whales. The transition from the early, elongated forms like Basilosaurus to the more familiar body plans of modern whales is a process that took place across the rest of the Paleogene and into the Neogene, the period that began approximately 23 million years ago and continues to the present. And during this long transition, one of the most significant events in the evolution of large body size in the ocean took place. The appearance of the filter-feeding whales, the baleen whales, whose evolutionary path would eventually lead to the largest animals ever to have lived on Earth. To understand why filter feeding matters to the story of size, it is useful to think about energy. An animal can grow to great size only if it can obtain a sufficient amount of food energy to sustain a very large body. Predators that chase and catch individual prey items face certain limitations. The prey must be large enough to be worth catching, but pursuing large prey carries risks, and there is an upper limit to how large individual prey items can become. But filter feeders bypass this constraint entirely. Instead of chasing individual large prey, they move through concentrations of small prey, capturing enormous numbers of very small items with each mouthful. The sea is full of small, energy-rich organisms, particularly the tiny crustaceans called krill, and a whale large enough to move through dense concentrations of krill can obtain enormous quantities of food, with relatively little expenditure of energy per calorie consumed. This strategy, filter feeding on dense aggregations of small prey, is one of the keys to the extraordinary size achieved by the baleen whales. But filter feeding requires specialized anatomy, and that anatomy did not appear fully formed. It developed gradually from ancestors that were toothed predators through intermediate stages in which the teeth became reduced and modified to the highly specialized filter feeding apparatus of modern baleen whales, in which the teeth are entirely replaced by plates of a material called baleen, which hangs from the upper jaw in overlapping rows and serves as a filter through which water is pushed while the prey is retained. The earliest ancestors of the baleen whales, sometime in the Eocene, appear to have possessed teeth, and they were toothed predators. The transition to filter feeding is one that researchers continue to study carefully, and the details of how teeth were gradually replaced by baleen and how the various filter feeding strategies of modern baleen whales evolved are subjects of ongoing investigation. But the fossil record contains hints of intermediate stages, including some early whales from the late Eocene and early Oligocene that possessed teeth that were small and closely spaced in a way that may have functioned as a primitive filter, and others that appear to have lost their teeth entirely before fully developed baleen appeared. The Oligocene epoch, which lasted from approximately 34 million years ago to 23 million years ago, was a time of significant change in the ocean environment. Global temperatures were declining from the warmth of the Eocene. The first ice sheets were forming on Antarctica, and ocean circulation patterns were shifting. The cooling of the water at high latitudes, combined with the particular patterns of ocean currents that develop as continents move and ocean basins change shape, or created conditions in which nutrients were brought to the surface in certain regions in great concentrations. Where there are nutrients, there is phytoplankton. Where there is phytoplankton, there is zooplankton. Where there is zooplankton, there is the potential for the dense aggregations of small prey that filter feeding can exploit. These changing ocean conditions of the Oligocene and the early Miocene were likely among the factors that favored the evolution of filter feeding in the whale lineage, providing the food resource that made an investment in large body size and specialized filter feeding anatomy worthwhile. The relationship between the physical environment of the ocean and the biology of its inhabitants is a deep and complex one. And the rise of the great baleen whales cannot be separated from the geological and oceanographic changes of the Cenozoic era. During the Miocene epoch, which lasted from approximately 23 million years ago to 5 million years ago, the baleen whales diversified significantly. Various groups emerged with different filter feeding strategies, different feeding habitats, and different body sizes. Some baleen whales were not particularly large by the standards of modern baleen whales, perhaps 8 to 10 meters in length, comparable to modern minke whales. Others were growing larger, and the conditions in the ocean were changing in ways that would eventually support the very largest forms. It is worth noting that during the Miocene, The toothed whales were also diversifying. The ancestors of modern dolphins, porpoises, sperm whales, and the various beaked whale lineages were establishing themselves and spreading through the ocean. Some of these toothed whale lineages also grew large. The sperm whale, which is the largest of the toothed whales living today, has ancestors that reach well back into the Miocene, and some extinct relatives of the sperm whale from the Miocene were, if anything, even larger and more formidably armed than the modern species. Leviathan melville, known from a partial skull and teeth found in Peru, was an enormous toothed whale from the Miocene, perhaps 13 to 17 meters in length, with teeth that were among the largest of any known animal, designed for hunting large prey, including other whales. It represents the extreme of a different evolutionary strategy, that of the very large active predator, as opposed to the very large filter feeder. The ocean of the Miocene was, in some respects, richer in large marine predators than the ocean of the present day. Among those predators was the great shark known to science as Otodus megalodon, or sometimes simply called megalodon. This animal, whose history is known almost entirely from its teeth, since shark skeletons are made of cartilage, which does not preserve as well as bone, was the largest predatory shark that ever lived, and one of the largest predatory fish of any kind in the history of life. Estimates of its size vary among researchers, as estimating the size of an animal from teeth alone is inherently uncertain, but many estimates place it at perhaps 10 to 18 meters in length, with some reaching larger figures still. The megalodon appears to have been a widespread predator in the Miocene and Pliocene oceans, occupying warm waters in many parts of the world. Its diet appears to have included large marine mammals, including cetaceans and fossilized whale bones. From this period, sometimes show marks consistent with megalodon tooth damage. It was, in its time, among the most formidable predators that had ever existed in the sea, and its presence in the Miocene Ocean serves as a reminder that the history of the ocean's giants is not only a story of the very large animals themselves, but of the ecosystems in which they lived, the prey they ate, the predators that hunted them, and the relationships among all of these things across vast stretches of time. Megalodon disappeared approximately 3.5 million years ago in the late Pliocene epoch. The reasons for its extinction are not entirely certain, as is often the case with extinct organisms. Changes in ocean temperature, shifts in the distribution of its prey species, and the evolution of more sophisticated whale behavior may all have contributed to its decline. The loss of megalodon opened the ocean in some ways, removing a predator that had been exerting pressure on cetacean populations for millions of years. And this change in the ecological landscape of the ocean may have been one of the factors that contributed to the subsequent evolution of even larger baleen whales. The Pliocene epoch, which lasted from approximately 5 million years ago to 2.5 million years ago, was a time of continued cooling as the Earth moved toward the ice ages of the Pleistocene. Ocean circulation was changing. At the formation of the Isthmus of Panama, the narrow land bridge connecting North and South America had closed the connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by approximately 3 million years ago, significantly altering the patterns of ocean circulation in both basins. In the North Atlantic, the closing of this connection helped establish or strengthen the circulation patterns that today bring warm water northward along the western boundary of the ocean and cold water southward along the eastern boundary, influencing the climate of Western Europe and the distribution of nutrients in the Atlantic. These changes in ocean circulation affected where cold, nutrient-rich water came to the surface, and therefore where the concentrations of krill and other small prey were greatest. The areas of high biological productivity, the upwelling zones where cold water rises and brings nutrients from the deep, became particularly important for large baleen whales, which needed to be able to find and exploit large concentrations of food. The beginning of the Pleistocene epoch, approximately 2.5 million years ago, brought the first of the great glacial cycles that have continued to the present. These cycles, in which ice sheets expanded across large portions of the northern hemisphere and then retreated over periods of tens of thousands of years, profoundly affected the ocean. Sea levels fell when ice sheets were at their maximum extent, as water was locked up in glacial ice, and rose again during interglacial periods when the ice retreated. Ocean temperatures fluctuated. The distribution of prey species shifted as conditions changed. And the whales, noted particularly the great baleen whales, lived through these cycles, migrating across ocean basins in response to shifting food resources, their populations responding to the fluctuating conditions of a world in the grip of an ice age. It is during the late Pliocene and Pleistocene that the blue whale, the largest animal known to have ever existed, appears to have achieved its greatest size. The blue whale, Balænoptera musculus, belongs to the family Balænopteridae, the rorqual whales, a group characterized by a streamlined body form, long pleated grooves on the throat that expand enormously during feeding, and the use of lunge feeding as their primary feeding strategy. A lunge-feeding whale accelerates toward a dense concentration of prey, opens its mouth enormously wide, engulfs a volume of water and prey, and then closes its mouth and pushes the water out through its baleen plates, retaining the prey. This feeding strategy, combined with the presence of dense concentrations of Antarctic krill in the waters of the Southern Ocean, allowed the blue whale to grow to extraordinary size. Adult blue whales commonly reach lengths of 24 to 27 meters, and some individuals have been measured at approaching 30 meters in length. Their weight can reach or exceed 150 metric tons. Their hearts are large enough that a small person could crawl through the aorta, the major blood vessel leading from the heart. Their tongues weigh as much as an elephant. Their voices, low-frequency calls that travel through the ocean for hundreds or perhaps thousands of kilometers, are among the loudest sounds produced by any animal. The blue whale is the largest known animal in the history of life, including the largest dinosaurs that walk the land. No terrestrial environment could support an animal of such mass, because the weight would simply be too great for legs to carry. Only in the ocean, where water provides buoyancy, and where a swimming animal does not need to support its own weight against gravity in the same way, could an animal of such dimensions exist. The ocean made the blue whale possible, as it had made the great Mesozoic marine reptiles possible before it, providing an environment in which the normal constraints on size that apply to terrestrial animals were substantially relaxed. But the blue whale did not appear fully formed. Its ancestors were smaller. The diversification of the rorqual whales and the achievement of very large body size within that group is a process that took place over millions of years, and the details of that process are still being investigated by researchers who study the fossil record of whales and the genetics of living whale populations. What the fossil record reveals is that many of the living species of large baleen whales, appear to have been relatively small in body size for most of their evolutionary history, and that the very large sizes seen in today's blue whales, fin whales, and bowhead whales may have evolved relatively recently, perhaps within the last 3 to 5 million years, during the late Pliocene and Pleistocene. This is a striking finding because it suggests that the largest body sizes in the history of life may have been achieved quite recently, in geological terms, and may be connected to the particular oceanographic conditions created by the cooling of the Pliocene and the onset of the glacial cycles. A study of whale body size through the fossil record suggests that the concentrations of krill that characterize the modern Southern Ocean and North Pacific in certain seasons may be a relatively recent phenomenon connected to the patterns of ocean circulation that developed as the world cooled. If the food concentrations that blue whales exploit today are partly a product of the Ice Age oceanography, then the very largest whales may be adapted to conditions that are themselves quite young by geological standards, conditions that formed over the past few million years, and that may not have existed in quite the same form before then. This connection between the physical environment of the ocean and the biology of its largest inhabitants is a recurring theme throughout the history of the ocean's giants. The Mesozoic marine reptiles were large, partly because the warm, productive Mesozoic ocean provided the food to support large bodies. The early whales diversified as the ocean's chemistry and circulation changed in the Paleogene. The great baleen whales grew to their maximum sizes as the Pliocene and Pleistocene ocean developed its particularly productive upwelling zones. The ocean's giants are not independent of the ocean. They are part of it, shaped by it, as much a product of its chemistry and physics as of the biological processes of evolution. Other large marine animals have followed their own evolutionary paths toward large body size, each one a separate story within the larger story of the ocean's giants. The whale sharks and basking sharks, for example, are the largest fish alive today, both of them filter feeders that swim slowly through the ocean, straining tiny organisms from the water. The whale shark can reach 12 to 14 meters in length, the basking shark perhaps 10 to 12 meters, both of them impressive in size, though modest compared to the great whales. These large filter-feeding sharks evolved their filter-feeding adaptations independently of the baleen whales, representing another example of convergent evolution, of different lineages arriving at similar solutions to similar ecological challenges. The ocean sunfish, or mola mola, represents another approach to large body size in the ocean. This remarkable fish, which can weigh over 2,000 kilograms and reach 3 meters in length, is the heaviest bony fish known. It feeds largely on jellyfish, which are not particularly nutritious, and its large size appears to be connected to the need to maintain body temperature in cold water while consuming a low-calorie diet. The ocean sunfish is not a predator of large prey, not a filter feeder of krill, but a patient pursuer of gelatinous prey across wide expanses of open ocean. The giant squid, Architeuthis dux, inhabits the deep ocean and was for a long time known only from fragments found in the stomachs of sperm whales or washed up on beaches. It was not until the early 21st century that live giant squid were photographed and filmed in their natural environment, confirming their size and habits. Giant squid can reach total lengths, including their long tentacles of perhaps 10 to 13 meters, with the body alone reaching 2 meters or more. They are cephalopods, mollusks related to octopuses and nautiluses, and they represent a remarkable example of large body size, achieved through entirely different means than the vertebrate giants of the ocean. The colossal squid, Mesonychoteuthis hamiltoni, is even larger in body mass than the giant squid, though somewhat shorter in total length. Known from specimens caught in Antarctic waters, the colossal squid is one of the least known of all large marine animals, its deep water habitat making study extremely difficult. Like the giant squid, it is a predator, equipped with hooks on its tentacles as well as suckers, and it is itself prey for sperm whales, which bear the scars of giant squid hooks on their skin. Even the leatherback sea turtle, though far smaller than the great whales, deserves mention as one of the largest reptiles alive today, and as another example of a lineage that retained its connection to the sea through the Mesozoic extinctions. Leatherback turtles can reach 2 meters in length and weigh over 900 kilograms, making them the largest of all living turtles by a considerable margin. They feed primarily on jellyfish, following the gelatinous creatures through enormous ranges of ocean, diving to considerable depths and tolerating cold water temperatures that would be lethal to most reptiles. Their ability to maintain body temperature in cold water through metabolic heat and countercurrent heat exchange in their blood vessels is one of their most remarkable adaptations, allowing them to range into cold, food-rich waters that smaller reptiles could not enter. All of these animals, the great whales, the whale sharks and basking sharks, the giant squids, the large sea turtles, share the ocean as their home and share the quality of large body size as a characteristic feature of their biology. But they arrived at that large body size through entirely different evolutionary paths from different ancestors in different geological periods in response to different environmental opportunities and challenges. The ocean's giants are not a single thing, they are many things, united by their size and their medium, but diverse in their origins, their biology, and their ecological roles. The ocean that contains them all is itself ancient beyond the span of any individual giant's existence, and it has contained giants before these. The Mesozoic marine reptiles that preceded the great whales were, in their time, the ocean's giants, filling ecological roles that the whales and sharks of today now occupy. Before the marine reptiles, the large predatory fish of the Devonian occupied those roles, and before them, the earliest large predators of the Cambrian and Ordovician seas. The ocean has always, given sufficient time and sufficient ecological opportunity, produced animals of great size. There is something in the ocean that tends toward the large. Perhaps it is the buoyancy that removes the constraints of gravity. Perhaps it is the vast extent of the medium, which allows animals to travel great distances in search of food, and therefore to exploit resources spread across enormous areas. Perhaps it is the particular way in which ocean food chains concentrate energy, by funneling the productivity of microscopic organisms up through layers of predation to the very large. Whatever the reasons, the ocean has been a place of giants throughout its long history, and the giants of today, though they differ in their origins from all that came before, are part of that long tradition of large life in a large place. There is also within the story of the ocean's giants a thread that connects the largest of them to the smallest. The blue whale, the largest animal that has ever lived, feeds on krill, crustaceans that are typically 2 to 6 centimeters in length. The largest animal in the history of life is sustained by creatures that a person could hold in a handful. This relationship between the vast and the minuscule, between the largest and the smallest, That is one of the most striking things about the ecology of the great baleen whales, and it is a relationship that has deep roots in the history of the ocean, in the long evolution of plankton and filter feeders, and the food webs that connect them. The krill that sustain the blue whale are themselves part of an ancient lineage. Small crustaceans have been present in the ocean since the Cambrian, and while krill as a group are not quite so ancient as that, they belong to a lineage with a history measured in tens of millions of years. They depend on the phytoplankton, the single-celled plants of the ocean, which are themselves descended from cyanobacteria, the microbes that first oxygenated the Earth's atmosphere billions of years ago. The chain that runs from ancient cyanobacteria to modern blue whale passes through billions of years and through organisms of every size, and it is one of the great continuous threads of biological history. As the Pleistocene continued with its cycles of glaciation and deglaciation, the great whales moved through a changing ocean. During glacial maxima, when ice sheets extended far southward in the northern hemisphere and sea levels fell, the distribution of food resources changed, and whale populations may have shifted their ranges accordingly. During interglacials, when the ice retreated and sea levels rose, different patterns prevailed. The whales adapted to these changes as they had adapted to changes before, their populations tracking the food resources they needed across the vast expanse of the ocean. The right whales. Bowhead whales, gray whales, humpback whales, fin whales, sei whales, minke whales, and blue whales, each with their own particular feeding strategies and habitats and migration patterns, filled different portions of the ocean and occupied different ecological roles within the larger community of marine life. Some fed in polar waters during summer, when the long days produced enormous phytoplankton blooms and the krill and other prey were dense and abundant, then migrated to warmer tropical or subtropical waters in winter to breed. Others remained in more temperate regions year-round. Some fed primarily near the surface, others at greater depths. The diversity of strategies among the large baleen whales reflects millions of years of evolutionary divergence from common ancestors, each lineage refining its adaptations to a particular way of life in a particular part of the ocean. The toothed whales, meanwhile, pursued their own evolutionary path. The sperm whale, which can reach 18 meters in length and is the largest toothed predator that has ever lived, developed its extraordinary diving abilities, capable of descending to depths of more than 2,000 meters in pursuit of giant squid and deep-water fish. The sperm whale's large, waxy head, filled with a substance called spermaceti, is thought to play a role in the regulation of buoyancy during diving, as well as in the production and focusing of the powerful sonar clicks that sperm whales use to navigate and hunt in the absolute darkness of the deep ocean. The evolution of echolocation in the toothed whale lineage is itself a long story, or with early forms of biosonar appearing in Eocene and Oligocene whales and becoming increasingly sophisticated over time, allowing toothed whales to exploit environments and prey that other large animals could not reach. The dolphins and porpoises, smaller relatives of the great whales, diversified extensively during the Miocene and Pliocene, their high intelligence and social behavior allowing them to exploit a wide variety of food resources across nearly all of the world's oceans. The orcas, or killer whales, which are actually the largest members of the dolphin family, evolved as apex predators, hunting in coordinated groups and capable of taking prey as large as blue whales, though such predation events are relatively rare. The story of the ocean's giants encompasses all of these creatures, from the largest to the largest predators, being from the filter feeders to the pursuit predators, from the ancient lineages of cartilaginous fish to the recently evolved marine mammals. It is a story of parallel evolution, of convergence, of the same solutions appearing again and again in different lineages, because the ocean presents the same challenges and opportunities to all of the animals that live within it. And it is a story of deep time, of hundreds of millions of years of slow, patient change, of body plans shifting gradually under the pressure of natural selection, of ecosystems assembling and disassembling across geological timescales. The ocean has changed dramatically over the course of this story. It has been warmer and colder. It has been higher and lower. Its circulation patterns have shifted as the continents moved. Its chemistry has changed, becoming more or less acidic, more or less oxygenated, richer or poorer in various nutrients. And through all of these changes, life in the ocean has persisted and diversified, always finding ways to use whatever conditions prevailed, always producing, in time, new forms adapted to new circumstances. The giants of today's ocean are the product of all that history. They are the inheritors of hundreds of millions of years of evolution in a medium that has itself been changing for 4.5 billion years. They are, in a very real sense, ancient things, even if the particular species that swim the ocean today are much more recent in origin than the geological eras through which the ocean has passed. They carry within them, in their genes, in their body plans, in their behaviors, traces of all that came before. A blue whale swimming through the Southern Ocean carries in its flippers the modified bones of the five-fingered hand of its terrestrial mammalian ancestors. It breathes air through lungs, not water through gills, as do all marine mammals, because its ancestors were air-breathing land animals. It is warm-blooded, as all mammals are, maintaining its body temperature through metabolic heat, a trait that allows it to function in the cold waters of the Antarctic, but that also requires it to consume enormous quantities of food to sustain its metabolism. Every one of these features is a window into its deep evolutionary history, a connection to the long story of life on Earth that stretches back far beyond the appearance of the first whale ancestor in the early Eocene. And the ocean itself, that ancient and patient medium, continues as it has always continued, its currents flowing, its chemistry cycling, its microscopic inhabitants converting sunlight to living matter, its larger inhabitants consuming and being consumed in the long, continuous flow of energy that sustains all marine life. The ocean is the constant within this story. The giants come and go across geological time. The ocean remains. In the Mesozoic, it held the great marine reptiles. In the Paleogene and Neogene, it welcomed the returning mammals and watched them transform themselves into creatures of the deep. And today, it holds the greatest giants that have ever lived, the blue whales and the fin whales and the sperm whales, swimming through water that has been cycling through the ocean basin for billions of years. Water that contains atoms that have been part of countless other living things before, that will be part of countless others after. This is the middle part of the story. The part where the foundations laid in the ancient ocean were built upon by new forms of life, where the extinction of old giants made room for new ones, where the slow drift of continents and the slow change of ocean chemistry shaped the evolution of animals whose bodies we can still observe today. The story is not finished. The ocean continues. and the great slow processes that have always driven life toward new forms and new sizes are still at work, as quietly and patiently as they have always been, in the depths of an ocean older than almost anything else that we know. The ocean that exists today is not exactly the ocean of any previous era. It is both old and young at the same time. Its waters have been cycling through the hydrological system of the Earth for billions of years. Yet the specific patterns of its currents, the particular arrangement of its basins and its continents, the detailed composition of its biology, all of these are specific to the present geological moment, a moment that is itself the product of everything that came before. The ocean of today has 5 major basins: the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian, the Arctic, and the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean, which encircles Antarctica, is in some ways the most important for the story of the ocean's largest giants because it is in the cold, productive waters of the Southern Ocean that the greatest concentrations of Antarctic krill are found. And it is on these krill that the blue whale, the fin whale, the sai whale, and several other large baleen whale species depend for the bulk of their nutrition during the feeding season. The Southern Ocean exists in its present form because of plate tectonics. As the ancient supercontinent Gondwana broke apart, South America and Antarctica separated, and Australia separated from Antarctica, creating the Drake Passage between South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, and the similar gaps that allow water to flow freely around the entire continent of Antarctica. This circumpolar current, which flows continuously from west to east around Antarctica, is one of the most powerful and most important ocean currents in the world. It effectively isolates the water mass around Antarctica, allowing it to become very cold, and it drives a pattern of circulation in which cold, dense water sinks at high latitudes and flows northward along the ocean bottom into all of the world's ocean basins, forming what is called Antarctic bottom water, one of the great water masses that defines the deep circulation of the global ocean. This pattern of circulation, in which deep, cold, nutrient-rich water is brought to the surface in certain regions by the action of winds and currents, is what makes the Southern Ocean so extraordinarily productive. The nutrients that accumulate in the deep water over centuries, the products of the slow decomposition of organic matter that sinks from the surface, are returned to the sunlit zone where phytoplankton can use them. The phytoplankton bloom in the long days of the Antarctic summer, producing vast quantities of organic matter. The krill feed on the phytoplankton, reaching densities so great that they can color the water reddish-orange over large areas. And the great whales converge on these concentrations, feeding intensively for months, accumulating the fat reserves that will sustain them through the leaner months of the year. This seasonal pattern, in which whales travel from warmer breeding grounds to cold, food-rich feeding grounds and back again, is one of the longest migrations of any animal on Earth. Humpback whales, for example, travel from breeding areas in tropical or subtropical waters near Hawaii, or in the Caribbean, or off the coast of Australia to feeding areas in Antarctica or Alaska, and then return, not a round trip that can exceed 16,000 kilometers. Gray whales make similarly impressive journeys along the western coast of North America, traveling from breeding lagoons in Baja California to feeding grounds in the Bering and Chukchi Seas and back, a round trip of perhaps 20,000 kilometers. These migrations are driven by the need to exploit seasonal food resources, to be in the cold, productive waters when the food is abundant, and in the warmer waters when the calves are born and need a stable, relatively predator-free environment in which to grow. The migrations of the great whales are themselves ancient behaviors, shaped by millions of years of evolution in an ocean whose productive regions have shifted as the continents moved and the climate changed. The specific routes that whales follow today are not necessarily identical to those of their ancestors in the Pliocene or even the Pleistocene, but the pattern of seasonal migration between breeding and feeding grounds is deeply embedded in the biology of these animals, a behavioral adaptation as fundamental as any physical one. The social lives of the great whales are complex in ways that continue to be revealed by researchers. Humpback whales produce their famous songs, long, structured sequences of sounds that change gradually over time and are shared among populations of males, apparently used in the context of reproduction. Sperm whales live in matrilineal social groups, with females and their young remaining together while males leave as they mature. And they communicate through patterns of clicks called codas that differ among different social groups, a form of cultural variation that is passed from generation to generation within families. Orca populations show similarly rich cultural variation, with different groups using different hunting techniques, different calls, different prey preferences, all learned from older individuals and transmitted through social learning. These aspects of whale biology, the sophisticated communication, the complex social structures, the cultural transmission of behaviors, are not direct products of large body size, but they are connected to it in important ways. Large body size in the baleen whales is associated with large brain size, and the large brains of whales and dolphins, proportionally among the largest of any animals relative to body size, support complex cognitive abilities, including the capacity for learning and for the social transmission of learned behaviors. The evolution of intelligence in the cetacean lineage is another long story within the larger story, one that begins with the social and communicative behaviors of the earliest toothed whales, and has continued to develop across tens of millions of years. As the Pleistocene glacial cycles continued through the past 2.5 million years, the ocean saw fluctuations in whale populations that are difficult to reconstruct in detail, but that left traces in the genetic variation of living whale populations. During glacial maxima, when the sea ice extended far from the poles and the distribution of food resources shifted, whale populations may have been divided into smaller groups isolated in different ocean basins or concentrated in particular regions where conditions remained suitable. During interglacials, when conditions improved and food resources expanded, populations could have grown and spread. These cycles of isolation and reconnection, of contraction and expansion, would have shaped the genetic diversity of whale populations in ways that geneticists can now study through the analysis of DNA from living whales. The reconstruction of historical whale population sizes through genetic analysis, a field that has developed substantially in recent decades, suggests that some large whale species had very large populations before any human influence on the ocean. Blue whale populations, for example, may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands before the era of commercial whaling, with similar or larger numbers for other large species. These populations were the culmination of millions of years of evolution, the most recent and in some ways the most extraordinary expression of the ocean's long tendency toward producing creatures of great size. The sharks, those ancient lineages that have been in the ocean since the Devonian, also present a picture of long evolutionary history in the modern ocean. The great white shark, Carcharodon carcharias, is often mentioned in the context of ancient lineages, as it is indeed a product of tens of millions of years of shark evolution. The great white belongs to a family called Lamnidae, whose members are among the most physiologically advanced sharks, and capable of maintaining body temperatures higher than the surrounding water through a system of heat exchange in their blood vessels, somewhat analogous to the mechanism that allows some large fish like tuna to remain warm in cold water. This thermal adaptation allows great white sharks to be active hunters in the cold waters, where many of their preferred prey, including sea lions and elephant seals, are found. The relationship between the great white shark and its prey is one of the ancient relationships in today's ocean, a predator-prey dynamic that has been shaped by millions of years of coevolution. The seals and sea lions that great white sharks hunt have evolved behaviors and physiological adaptations that help them avoid predation, while the sharks have evolved their remarkable sensory systems, hunting strategies, and physical capabilities in a context that includes the vigilance and agility of their prey. These are the living remnants of the evolutionary arms races that have always characterized predator-prey relationships in the ocean. Arms races that stretch back in principle to the Cambrian, when the first predators and the first prey began the long dance that has been a central feature of ocean ecology ever since. The whale shark, which can reach lengths of 12 to 14 meters and is the largest fish alive today, represents a very different evolutionary history than the great white. The whale shark belongs to a group called the Orectolobiforms, the carpet sharks, and its filter-feeding strategy evolved independently of any similar strategy in other fish lineages. Its wide, flat head and cavernous mouth, held open as it swims slowly through concentrations of plankton and small fish, is an anatomy that evolved over tens of millions of years from ancestors that were conventional predatory sharks. The transformation from active predator to passive filter feeder is a remarkable evolutionary transition, and the whale shark is one of only 3 shark species to have made it, the others being the basking shark and the megamouth shark. The basking shark, Cedorhynus maximus, can reach 10 to 12 meters in length and is found in temperate and cool waters of both hemispheres. Like the whale shark, it feeds by swimming with its mouth wide open, filtering enormous quantities of water through gill rakers that trap zooplankton, primarily copepods. It is a more active swimmer than the whale shark in cold waters, and it undergoes substantial migrations between summer feeding areas and areas where it spends the winter, though the details of its winter behavior, including where it goes and what it does, have only recently begun to be understood through the use of satellite tags attached to individual animals. The megamouth shark, Megachasma pelagios, is the least known of the 3 filter-feeding shark species and one of the least known large fish of any kind. First discovered in 1976 when one was accidentally caught entangled in a sea anchor off Hawaii, it is known from only a few hundred individuals encountered since then. It has a very large head with a wide mouth, lined with numerous small teeth modified for filter feeding, and it appears to feed primarily on jellyfish and small crustaceans at mid-water depths, making it a deep-water filter feeder in contrast to the more surface-oriented whale shark and basking shark. The diversity of large animals in today's ocean reflects the long evolutionary history described across the earlier parts of this account. The hundreds of millions of years through which different lineages experimented with different approaches to life in the sea, and in which natural selection refined, retained, and sometimes radically transformed those approaches. Every large animal in the ocean today is the product of that history, connected through its ancestry to all that came before, shaped by environments that have themselves been shaped by the long processes of geological change. The deep ocean, which occupies the largest habitat on Earth by volume, is home to giants of its own kind, adapted to conditions of extreme pressure, total darkness, and very cold temperatures. The sperm whale, already mentioned as the largest of the toothed predators, regularly descends to depths of 1 kilometer or more, and has been recorded at depths exceeding 2 kilometers in pursuit of its preferred prey. The giant squid that sperm whales hunt live at these depths, apparently spending much of their time in the mesopelagic and bathipelagic zones, the twilight and dark regions of the open ocean where sunlight does not reach. The deep ocean was, until relatively recently, almost entirely unknown. The exploration of deep ocean habitats has been one of the great scientific adventures of the past century, and it continues to reveal species and ecosystems that were previously unknown. The discovery of hydrothermal vents in 1977 opened a new chapter in the understanding of ocean biology, revealing ecosystems that derive their energy not from sunlight and photosynthesis, but from the chemical energy of the hot, mineral-rich water that pours from cracks in the ocean floor. These vent ecosystems, which include tube worms that can reach over 2 meters in length, giant clams, and various other organisms that are far larger than their relatives in the sunlit ocean, are a reminder that the ocean contains forms of life still being discovered, still being understood, still revealing the depths of its biological diversity. The history of the ocean's surface, meanwhile, is written in the sediments that have accumulated on the ocean floor over hundreds of millions of years. Each layer of sediment contains the microscopic remains of the organisms that lived in the water above, the shells of foraminifera, the silica skeletons of radiolarians and diatoms, the calcareous scales of coccolithophores, and many other tiny things. These sediment layers preserve a record of past ocean temperatures, past ocean chemistry, past biological communities that researchers can read through careful analysis, reconstructing in fine detail the history of an ocean that was ancient long before any human civilization existed to observe it. It is through the study of these sediment cores, drilled from the ocean floor by research vessels operating in all of the world's ocean basins, that much of what is known about the history of the ocean's chemistry and temperature has been learned. The oxygen isotope ratios preserved in the shells of foraminifera record the temperature of the water in which they lived and the volume of ice on the Earth's surface, because the oxygen in glacial ice is slightly lighter than the oxygen in the ocean. By measuring these isotope ratios in sediment layers laid down at different times, researchers can reconstruct the history of ice volume and ocean temperature across millions of years, revealing the detailed pattern of the glacial cycles and the longer-term trends of Cenozoic cooling that set the context for the evolution of the great whales. The carbon isotope ratios in these same sediments record changes in biological productivity and in the cycling of carbon through the ocean and atmosphere, providing information about how the ocean's ecosystems have changed over time. The presence of particular microscopic organisms in different sediment layers records changes in the distribution of different water masses and different ecological conditions. Each layer is, in a sense, a snapshot of the ocean as it was at a particular moment in geological time, and reading those snapshots in sequence allows the reconstruction of a long, complex, and still not fully understood history. The story that emerges from this study of the sediment record, combined with the fossil record of marine vertebrates and the genetic analysis of living whale populations, is one of extraordinary complexity and contingency. The ocean giants of today are not inevitable. They are the product of particular geological events, particular climate changes, particular extinctions and recoveries, in particular oceanographic configurations that happen to create the conditions necessary for very large body size. If the continents had moved differently, if the extinctions had fallen differently, if the climate had developed differently, the ocean today might be full of very different creatures, different giants or perhaps no giants at all. But the ocean did develop as it did. The continents moved to their present positions. The extinctions happened as they did. The climate cooled in the way it cooled. The great whales evolved. And the ocean today holds in its depths and at its surface the most extraordinary collection of large animals in the history of life. It is worth spending some time with the blue whale itself, the culmination of this long story, the largest known animal that has ever existed. Thus, a blue whale in the Southern Ocean during the Antarctic summer is a creature of almost incomprehensible scale. Its body, a deep blue-gray in color with patterns of lighter spots and mottling, can be 30 meters long, a length that is difficult to appreciate without a reference point. It would comfortably exceed the length of 3 London double-decker buses placed end to end. Its flukes, the broad horizontal tail fins that provide its primary propulsion, span 7 or 8 meters from tip to tip. Its blowhole, through which it breathes, produces a spout of mist that can rise 9 meters into the air. The blue whale's feeding dive takes it down perhaps 200 to 300 meters into the dense layers of krill that aggregate at depth during the day. It accelerates toward the krill, opens its enormous mouth, and engulfs a volume of water that may exceed 80,000 liters in a single gulp. The pleated skin of its throat and belly expands enormously to accommodate this volume, the grooves on its throat opening like an accordion. And then the whale slows and closes its mouth, the muscles of its tongue pushing the water out through the baleen plates while the krill are retained. Each lunge may capture several kilograms of krill, and a whale makes many such lunges during a feeding dive. Over the course of a day's feeding during the productive summer season, a blue whale may consume 3 to 4 metric tons of krill. This feeding behavior is itself the product of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The lunge feeding strategy of the rorqual whales, of which the blue whale is the largest member, involves complex coordinations of acceleration, mouth opening, engulfment, and filtration that require precise neuromuscular control and that place extreme physical demands on the whale's body. The tongue alone, which in a blue whale can weigh 3 metric tons, must be rapidly pulled backward and downward as the mouth opens to allow the engulfment of the prey-laden water. The pleated skin of the throat must expand against the resistance of the water being engulfed and then contract again as the water is expelled. The hydrodynamics of lunge feeding in large rorqual whales have been studied by researchers using various instruments attached to free-swimming whales, and the physical forces involved are remarkable. But the evolution of increasingly large body size in the rorqual whales appears to have been driven in part by the energetics of lunge feeding, because larger whales can engulf proportionally more water and more prey per lunge relative to the energy they expend in doing so. There is a beneficial scaling relationship between body size and the efficiency of lunge feeding that may have favored the evolution of larger and larger body sizes over the course of the Pliocene and Pleistocene, as long as the prey was sufficiently dense and abundant to make the investment in a very large body worthwhile. This is a specific hypothesis about the drivers of large body size in baleen whales that continues to be investigated and refined by researchers, but it illustrates the kind of ecological and biomechanical reasoning that helps to explain why the largest animals in history are, specifically, large filter feeders in the ocean rather than large land animals or large active predators. The fin whale, the second largest animal alive today, can reach 27 meters in length and is also a rorqual, using the same lunge feeding strategy as the blue whale, but feeding on a broader range of prey, including not only krill, but also schooling fish such as herring and capelin. The sei whale, the third largest, is somewhat smaller, reaching 17 meters, and tends to feed in more temperate waters than the blue and fin whales. The humpback whale, which reaches about 16 meters and is perhaps the most familiar of the great whales to general audiences because of its acrobatic behavior and complex songs, also feeds by lunging but has evolved several specialized cooperative feeding techniques, including the use of bubble nets, in which groups of humpbacks swim in spiraling circles below a school of fish, releasing air bubbles that form a cylindrical net of rising bubbles that confine the fish, allowing the whales to lunge upward through the concentrated prey. The bowhead whale, which is not a rorqual but belongs instead to the right whale family, achieves its large size, up to 18 to 20 meters, through a different filter feeding strategy. Rather than lunging, it is a skimmer, swimming slowly at or near the surface with its mouth partly open, the water flowing continuously through its very long baleen plates and filtering out the small copepods and other tiny crustaceans that form its diet. The bowhead is adapted to life in Arctic waters, spending its entire life in or near the sea ice, capable of breaking through ice with its massive head to breathe. It is one of the longest-lived animals known, with individuals believed to reach ages of 200 years or more based on the evidence of old harpoon heads found embedded in the blubber of animals caught in the 20th century, heads that were last manufactured in the 19th century. 200 years. This is a lifespan that puts an individual whale in contact with historical time in a way that is striking. A bowhead whale, born in the early decades of the 19th century, could have been alive during the era of the great Yankee whalers who hunted its species to severely reduced numbers, and could still have been alive if it survived into the era of scientific study and conservation in the 20th century. It is a lifespan that approaches the timescale of human historical memory, though still vastly shorter than the geological timescales that dominate the rest of this account. The right whale family, which includes the bowhead, the North Atlantic right whale, and the North Pacific right whale, is itself an ancient lineage within the baleen whales, diverging from the rorqual lineage many millions of years ago. The North Atlantic right whale, Eubalaena glacialis, is today one of the most endangered large whale species, with a population of perhaps 300 individuals or fewer. The name right whale comes from the perspective of historical whalers who considered it the right whale to hunt because it was slow-moving, floated when killed, and had long baleen plates and thick blubber, valuable for oil and commercial products. This characteristic that made right whales easy to hunt is the same characteristic that has made their recovery from heavy historical whaling extremely slow. Because slow reproduction and the loss of most of a population's individuals leaves a species vulnerable to ongoing mortality from entanglement and ship strikes for many generations. The gray whale, which migrates along the western coast of North America, is another ancient lineage within the baleen whales, the only living member of its family. It is unusual among large baleen whales in that it feeds primarily by filtering sediment on the shallow seafloor, sucking up mouthfuls of muddy sediment and filtering out the small crustaceans and other organisms that live within it. The gray whale's feeding grounds in the Arctic leave distinctive pits in the seafloor sediment, visible to researchers who have studied these environments. This bottom-feeding strategy is unique among large cetaceans and represents another variation on the theme of filter feeding, applied to a habitat and prey community quite different from those exploited by the open-water rorquals. The sperm whale occupies a very different ecological position from all of these filter feeders. As the largest toothed predator alive today and one of the most extreme divers among air-breathing animals, the sperm whale's ecology centers on its pursuit of deep-water prey, primarily large cephalopods, in the permanent darkness of the ocean's mesopelagic and bathypelagic zones. The sperm whale's brain is the largest in the animal kingdom, weighing about 9 kilograms in large adult males, and its cognitive abilities, as suggested by its complex social behaviors and vocal communication, are considerable. Male sperm whales can reach 18 meters and weigh perhaps 57 metric tons, while females are considerably smaller, a degree of size difference between the sexes that is larger than in any other whale species. The sperm whale's relationship with the giant squid is one of the most famous predator-prey interactions in the ocean, and though its details remain incompletely understood because both animals are difficult to observe in their natural deep-water environment. Giant squid have been found in sperm whale stomachs in large numbers, and the skin of sperm whales frequently bears circular scars from giant squid suckers, suggesting active struggles between hunter and prey at great depths. The evolutionary history of this relationship between the largest toothed predator and one of the largest invertebrates in the ocean stretches back millions of years, both lineages evolving in the context of each other over geological time. The orcas, or killer whales, which are, as noted, the largest dolphins rather than true whales in the technical sense, represent yet another approach to large body size and apex predation in the ocean. Male orcas can reach 9 or 10 meters in length, and while this is modest compared to the great baleen whales or the sperm whale, orcas are by far the most powerful and versatile predators in the modern ocean. Different populations or ecotypes of orcas specialize in very different prey, with some populations feeding almost exclusively on fish like herring or salmon, others specializing in marine mammals like seals and sea lions or even dolphins, and others known to attack and kill even blue whales, the largest animals on Earth, in coordinated group attacks. The cognitive and social sophistication of orcas, combined with their physical capability and their cultural transmission of learned hunting techniques, makes them unique among marine predators. The sophisticated cooperative hunting techniques used by different orca populations, from the wave-washing technique used to knock seals off ice floes in Antarctica, to the deliberate beaching behavior used to catch sea lions on beaches in Argentina, to the coordinated herding of fish schools used by fish-eating populations in the North Atlantic and North Pacific, are all learned behaviors, transmitted from mothers to offspring and among group members, not innate instincts. They are, in a very real sense, cultural behaviors, and the orca populations that practice them are, in a meaningful sense, distinct cultural groups. This cultural dimension of orca behavior is itself a product of the long evolution of cetacean intelligence and sociality, a process that began with the earliest toothed whales and has been refined across tens of millions of years of evolution in a medium that rewards complex cognition, sophisticated communication, and social cooperation. The intelligence of whales and dolphins is not a simple or single thing, but a collection of cognitive abilities that have been shaped by the particular demands of life in the ocean, by the need to navigate across vast distances, to locate food in a three-dimensional medium that blocks visual information at most distances, to coordinate with other individuals in social groups, and to learn and remember and transmit information across generations. The ocean that holds all of these remarkable creatures is itself changing, as it has always changed, though the rate and nature of some of those changes in the present are different from anything in the previous history of the ocean. The chemistry of the ocean is shifting. The patterns of circulation are being affected. The distribution of prey species is changing. These are processes that, like all the geological and environmental changes described throughout this account, will have consequences for the living things of the ocean over time. The ocean has absorbed many changes over its 4.5 billion-year history, and its ecosystems have always, given sufficient time, found ways to respond. The timescales of response are geological, however, measured in thousands and millions of years rather than decades or centuries, and this difference in timescale between the pace of change and the pace of biological response is something that researchers who study the ocean and its inhabitants consider carefully. The deep time perspective that this account has tried to maintain throughout has its own kind of comfort in it. A reminder that the ocean's history is enormously long and enormously resilient, that it has survived catastrophes that make any present disruption seem modest, and that life in the ocean has continued and diversified through all of those catastrophes. At the same time, the deep time perspective also reveals how precious and contingent the present moment is, how the particular configuration of ocean and biology that produce the blue whale and the sperm whale and the right whale is the product of a unique sequence of events that will not be exactly repeated. The great whales have existed in forms close to their present ones for millions of years. They have swum through ice ages and warm periods, through shifts in ocean circulation, through changes in the distribution of their prey, through all the variations that the ocean has offered across the Pliocene and Pleistocene. They have been part of the ocean's ecology for long enough that their effects on the ocean's nutrient cycles, through their feeding, their migrations, and their biological processes, are substantial. Whales carry nutrients from deep feeding grounds to the surface through their feces, contributing to the fertilization of surface waters. They transport nutrients across ocean basins through their migrations. When they die, their bodies sink to the ocean floor and provide food for deep-sea communities for decades, a phenomenon called a whale fall. These ecological contributions of large whales to the ocean's functioning are themselves a product of the long coevolution of whale biology and ocean ecology. The ocean that whales have inhabited for tens of millions of years has been shaped in part by their presence within it, as all ecosystems are shaped by their inhabitants over time. The relationship between the blue whale and the Antarctic krill, and the phytoplankton and the nutrient cycles of the Southern Ocean, is a relationship of mutual dependence and mutual influence. Not simply a one-way process in which the whale simply exploits the resources of the ocean, but a complex interchange in which the whale's presence is itself part of what makes the ocean productive. As this long account draws toward its close, it is fitting to return to the quality that has been at its center throughout: the extraordinary largeness of the ocean's greatest inhabitants and the long, slow, ancient processes that produced it. The size of the blue whale is not an accident. It is not a curiosity. It is the outcome of 4.5 billion years of planetary history, of the formation of oceans and the evolution of life within them, of the oxygenation of the atmosphere by ancient microbes, of the development of complex cells in complex bodies, of the Cambrian diversification and the Devonian age of fishes, of the Mesozoic marine reptiles in their extinction, of the return of mammals to the sea and their 55 million years of transformation from small four-legged creatures at the edge of the ancient Tethys to the greatest animals that have ever lived. Every kilogram of the blue whale's 150 metric tons is, in a sense, the product of all that history. Every meter of its 30-meter length is a consequence of the long sequence of events described throughout this account. The blue whale is ancient history made flesh, made enormous, made alive and swimming in a cold ocean that is itself the product of ancient geological processes. And the blue whale is not alone in this. The sperm whale, diving into darkness in pursuit of giant squid, the humpback whale composing its long and changing song in warm tropical waters, the orca coordinating with its family in the pursuit of prey, the whale shark filtering plankton slowly through a tropical ocean, the basking shark opening its mouth to the cold North Atlantic swell, the great white shark sensing the electromagnetic field of a seal beneath it in dark water. All of these are products of the same long history, all of them inheritors of the ocean's long generosity toward large and complex life. The ocean continues. It is deep enough to hold the largest things that life has produced, and patient enough to wait for life to produce them. Its currents still flow in the patterns established by the positions of the continents, which are still slowly moving, still changing the shape of the ocean basins over timescales that no living thing will observe in a single lifetime. Its sediments still accumulate on the deep floor, layer upon layer, preserving the record of everything that has lived within it. Its chemistry still cycles through the great loops of carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus that sustain all biological activity in the sea. And in its depths and at its surface, in its warm tropical shallows and its cold polar waters, in its sunlit upper zone and its lightless abyssal depths, the great animals of the ocean move as they have always moved, slowly or swiftly as their nature requires, following food and following each other, breathing and diving and singing and feeding, carrying within their large bodies the long memory of everything that the ocean has been, and everything that life within it has become over the immense span of geological time. This is the story of the ocean's giants. It is a story without a definitive ending because the ocean continues and life within it continues, slowly changing as it has always slowly changed, always working toward new forms, new adaptations, new expressions of the possibility of large life in an ancient and vast medium. The blue whale swimming in the Southern Ocean today is both the culmination of everything described in this account and also, in the long view of geological time, simply another chapter in a story that began with the first stirrings of life in an ancient sea and that continues in whatever forms the future will eventually produce. The ocean is patient. It has time, it has always had time, and in that time, quietly and without hurry, it has made the largest things the world has ever known, and it holds them still in its deep and ancient water, far beneath the surface, in the slow blue dark.